in one of your books, in The Eyes of the Skin, you make this, in the first part of the book, this story about how vision was, or how architecture, and I don't know if only architecture, was constructed as depending only on vision. And it's like a story of modernity or modern architecture. How that became the story of modern architecture, and when and why, or has it ended that way of only regarding architecture as a visual artifact?
Well, that story begins with the Greeks, because already Aristotle classified the five senses, and vision was the most important sense for him, and touch the least important. And that tradition has continued until today. And of course, in the modern age, there are so many inventions that reinforce visibility and vision. So no doubt we are the most vision-centered culture in history.
So has it changed in response to new technologies, the way that we suppose that vision is the most important of the senses? Are those, like cameras and the internet, all of that, made it even more important to see, to take vision as the more important of the senses?
Well, they have expanded the field of vision, and somehow also already the Greeks considered the eyes as the most important witnesses, and that understanding that vision is seeing truth, that has also been a metaphor in most of philosophy. So the primacy of vision of the senses is strengthened by several inventions or attitudes. But in reality, there are writers who argue strongly that until 18th century or early 19th century, people lived more in auditive worlds than visual worlds, which suggests that it has really been the technological revolution that has made the eye almost a dictator of the senses.
How does it evolve, this other story of this? Is a parallel or marginal story of architecture for the senses, for the other senses?
Well, architecture has been also considered as a visual art form, although Vitruvius classifies or names, I think, about 15 different areas that the architect has to master, one of them being acoustics. It is the difference is that between vision and the other senses is that the other senses are enveloping, embracing senses. You are inside the experience, whereas in vision you are always outside, and that is where also our spectator role, passive spectator role of the modern man enters.
I once read a book by a Spanish or Catalan philosopher, Eugenio Trias, and he said that music and architecture were like primitive or archaic arts because they touch our skin. They work on the atmosphere, on the habitat.
That was also Walter Benjamin's view. He didn't speak of music, but he said cinema and architecture are both tactile arts, which first sounds like an outrageous argument, but when you think of it, it becomes understandable.
And that's interesting because you have written also about film and architecture.
Yes.
What's the difference between architecture just like an image, like in photography, and when it becomes part of a film? It's the narrative part?
Well, I have mainly been interested in the notion of existential space, how we live or understand or experience human life. And cinema and architecture both stage human life or frame it in a specific way. And that framing is very similar in cinema and architecture. Of course, architecture is an embodied experience, but just for the notion of existential space, they come really close. And that is why I believe that films can teach architects very much.
And continuing with the idea of films and architecture, also Benjamin, but I think that after Benjamin, David Leder-Barrow has talked about how in films we don't focus or we don't pay attention to architecture. Architecture is like this thing that surrounds us, like an atmosphere,
Yes,
what you talked about today.
Yes. Well, that's what is the case in normal life. People are not consciously aware of architecture, but architecture still has an impact on how we experience our intimate world and eventually also ourselves. So architecture has its power regardless of whether we become conscious of it or not.
I sometimes think that this thing that architects, we sometimes say that there's a lack of understanding between the normal people and architects, has to do with this exigence of architects to regard or to look architecture when architecture is not to be looked upon but to be lived.
Yes. I have written about that. There are two architectures. One architecture for the professional people who have a trained eye and specific viewing points and issues that we observe, whereas for a normal dweller it's home or working place and without much analysis beyond that. But still, I think architecture has the same impact on both groups. The last essay which I have written was 3 weeks ago, an essay which was entitled Empathic Imagination, which I think is the highest quality of imagination. The lower quality is projective imagination, where we are able to project a geometric or topological figure like a building into imaginary space, but it takes another subtlety of imagination to be able to feel how it feels. And an architect, I think, needs this empathetic imagination.
Making a short story of your books, you wrote about the eye, the eyes of the skin, then of the hand,
Yes.
then of the body, and now you're going to write about the brain, is what you
Yes,
told us.
yes.
So you're going deeper from the skin to the brain?
Yes, there has been no plan whatsoever, but this is something that often happens to me, that I just feel myself that I'm drifting without any conscious planning from my part.
Do we have to resist this power of the image, or do we have to fight it? And how could we do it if we have to?
I think we have to be critical of it. I don't think we necessarily need or even can resist it, but just to be aware of the degree in which we are manipulated by images. And in my book on the embodied image, I categorize two images. One which focuses and sort of imprisons one into a desired emotional reaction, and the other one which is the poetic one, which opens and empowers the individual. And I think art at large deals with this empowering and opening up, liberating, emancipating imagery.